Well, good morning, and welcome to our third and final day of this Templeton Colloquium. My name is Don Steluto. I'm the Associate Director for the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study, and it's indeed a great pleasure to welcome you here. This morning we have a great lineup for you, and before we get started with that, I do want to express the Institute's profound thanks to the John Templeton Foundation. It's due to their generosity and through a grant that they made to the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study that this colloquium has been made possible. Let me say a few words about the colloquium, particularly for some of the folks for whom this is new. This colloquium was conceived of by Douglas Hedley, one of this year's Templeton Fellows at the NDIAS. Douglas desired to spark an interdisciplinary discussion with a number of scholars on this fundamental topic. He set out some initial thoughts in his pre-circulated paper, but he wanted to do much more than that. His intent was to have our presenters and all of you respond to, comment on, and engage Douglas on what he had presented and to offer additional ideas. He particularly sought ideas that emanated from distinctive perspectives based upon a range of disciplines and fields. To Douglas's credit, an objective of this colloquium is to have multiple, even divergent perspectives presented. This is one of 8 sessions that we've had and will continue to have through the rest of today on this particular topic, and they're all designed to accomplish these objectives. Now, the format for our session this morning is as follows. First, Douglas Hedley will offer his explanation of how this session plays into the larger work that he's pursuing on participation. Secondly, our 2 presenters, Gillett and Phillip Sloan, will present their thoughts on the topic of participation, the image of God, and evolutionary theory. They will be followed by Douglas Hedley, who will provide a brief response and a commentary. The third and final component of this morning's session will be a larger discussion with all of you participating. This will include an opportunity for you to ask questions or to raise comments, as well as the folks who are watching us on the live stream via the university website. They will all also have an opportunity to ask questions via our colloquium blog. As you have questions or comments for us this morning, when we get to that portion of the program, go ahead and signal to me that you have a question or comment. And as I call on you, Nick will bring the microphone on over to you. We ask you to do 2 things. First, identify yourself before asking your question. And secondly, speak loudly. Our presenters this morning are Carl Gillett, Phillip Sloan, and Douglas Hedley. Carl Gillett is professor of philosophy at Northern Illinois University, and he specializes in philosophy of mind, metaphysics, and philosophy of science. His recent research is on the metaphysics of science, including work on composition, reduction, and emergence in the sciences, with a special focus on the neurosciences and psychology. He is author of Reduction and Emergence in the Sciences, which is forthcoming, and co-editor of Physicalism and Its Discontents. Among his honors and awards, Professor Gillett has served as a participant in the Templeton Oxford Seminars on Science and Christianity, and as a visiting fellow at the Center for Philosophy of Religion at the University of Notre Dame. He has received fellowships from the John Templeton Foundation and more recently, the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. Phillip Sloan is Professor Emeritus in the program of Liberal Studies and the graduate program in the History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Notre Dame. His research interests include the history and philosophy of the life sciences in the modern period, the history of evolutionary theory, Enlightenment natural theory, and intellectual history. He is the co-editor of and contributor to Creating a Biophysics of Life, the 3-man paper and early molecular biology, Controlling Our Destinies, Philosophical, Historical, and Ethical Perspectives on the Human Genome Project, and Darwin and the 21st Century, Nature, humanity, and God. Professor Sloan is a fellow and past president of Section L of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and he is closely involved in the Notre Dame Initiative on Adult Stem Cell Research. Douglas Hedley is reader in Hermeneutics and Metaphysics at the University of Cambridge, and he currently serves as Templeton Fellow at the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. He specializes in Neoplatonism, the Cambridge Platonists, aspects of Romantic and Idealist thought, and the philosophy of religion. His monographs include Sacrifice Imagined, Violence, Atonement, and the Sacred, Living Forms of the Imagination, and Aids to Reflection and the Mirror of the Spirit, Coleridge, Philosophy, and Religion. He is the principal investigator of a United Kingdom Arts and Humanities Research Council grant that's entitled Revisioning Cambridge Platonism, and he currently serves as co-chair of the Platonism, Neoplatonism group at the American Academy of Religion. Without further ado, I turn it over to Carl Gillett, Phillip Sloan, and Douglas Hedley.
Thank you very much, Don. It's one of the joys, but also the frustrations of philosophy that some of its core concepts are the most mysterious and intractable. Think of cause or freedom or time. And it seems to me that we're in a similar position with the ancient idea of participating in the divine mind or participating in the ideas. So it's a great pleasure and honor for me to introduce two philosophers that I've learned a great deal from in the last few months in this wonderful time at Notre Dame, Carl Gillett and Phillip Sloan. And I think Carl is going to start off this morning.
Okay, good. So I'd like to thank Douglas for inviting me to be involved in the session, so I'm going to avoid the participation jokes. Is that going to be loud enough? I just... Okay, how about here? Oh, okay, great. Great, thank you. So I'd like to thank Douglas for inviting me, and I guess one of the things that has been on my mind is how did I get here and why am I here? And I don't mean that in any broad or profound sense. I mean that really quite narrowly. What on earth am I doing in a conference on participation? But Douglas has already kind of explained how I got here. The great thing about NDIAS is that you interact with people from very different orientations and spark all kinds of productive interactions. And I've been listening to Douglas's various presentations, and those have really been quite stimulating for me. And of course, I'm lucky enough that I get the chance to actually talk to Douglas by the photocopier over coffee. So the reason why you might wonder why I'm here is that I am a die-hard methodological naturalist. Absolutely die-hard. It's really, but the reason why I'm a die-hard methodological naturalist about space, time, and its contents is that approach has proved its worth many, many times over. It's incredibly successful as an approach to understanding nature and what's in it. I don't know of any other approaches that have shown success to that degree, or really much success at all, in investigating nature and its contents. But of course, if anybody who's an honest methodological naturalist will tell you there are many unfinished projects with regard to nature. There's a great deal about nature that we don't know how to fit into a methodological naturalist picture. We have great problems with mental causation, we have great problems with human agency, we have great problems with the mathematical, we have great problems with the moral, we have great problems with the aesthetic. So, talking to Douglas and learning a little bit about participation has been very stimulating for me, because the thing that immediately struck me was, gosh, here's this notion of participation, and it seems to offer me as a methodological naturalist some new resources for grappling with these unsolved problems. And I'm always looking for new resources. I'm always looking for things that can help me in my constructive projects. So what I'm going to do today is actually look at whether participation offers resources to someone who is a thoroughgoing methodological naturalist with regard to understanding nature. Okay? Now, let me just begin by really being careful to emphasize that I don't take methodological naturalism as an approach to nature to preclude the existence of entities beyond space and time. Methodological naturalism is a fantastic way of understanding what's around here in space and time. But I don't take that to show very much at all about what else there might be beyond space and time. So I think methodological naturalism leaves it open whether there's something else beyond space and time. I also contend that the acceptance of what we might call those transcendent entities is perfectly compatible with the findings of methodological naturalism over the last few centuries in the sciences. Okay, but even given that last qualification, which unfortunately many methodological naturalists don't quite seem to get, you might still think, what on earth is he doing? What a bizarre project. A methodological naturalist is going to discuss what participation might do for methodological naturalism. And the reason you might think that's bizarre is that so many people right now assume that methodological naturalism leads to scientific reductionism, and scientific reductionism is a clear form of ontological reductionism. But that ontological reductionism says that all there is in space and time is little microphysical guys bashing around into each other. And you don't need participation, really, to illuminate those guys any further. So your project is still kind of vacuous. Okay, so although I think it's a common claim amongst opponents of methodological naturalism, and I think many proponents of methodological naturalism, I think it's just fundamentally mistaken. This idea that methodological naturalism necessarily collapses into scientific reductionism and ontological reduction, I think that's fundamentally a mistaken assumption. So I've just finished a book called, actually, Reduction, Emergence in Science and Philosophy. And that book engages the ongoing scientific debates about reduction and emergence, which are extremely lively in the sciences right now. And one of the main contentions of that book is that there are at least two big live options in the sciences that are battling it out in ongoing discussions. And one of those positions is a thoroughly anti-reductionist form of methodological naturalism. It opposes explicitly scientific reductionism. The book tries to articulate what the nature of that position is and why it's a coherent and live position. Okay? So, for those kind of anti-reductionist methodological naturalists, I think participation might be interesting. But here's what I'm actually going to do given that orientation. So, the first thing I'm going to do is just lay out my idiosyncratic take on what's going on in the sciences and in methodological naturalism. So I'll lay out why this common presumption that methodological naturalism has to be ontologically reductionist, why I think that's mistaken. And I'll just sketch the shape of this anti-reductionist methodological naturalist position that is so the focus of so much interest in the sciences right now. Because you need to understand the shape of that anti-reductionist position to see where participation might come in and why. So that's the first part of the talk. And then the second part of the little talk will be, once we understand the shape of this anti-reductionist position, then let's go and see what participation might do for that kind of methodological naturalist. So that's what I'm going to try and do. All in 20 minutes. Okay, so the scientific background. So hopefully this will be fairly familiar to some of you, but I'll throw some controversial things in the mix. So to understand where we are in the sciences, you've got to understand the evidential background. And the evidential background in the sciences, philosophers still often characterize the issue as being a debate between people who endorse physicalism, the claim that there's comprehensive composition in nature, and opponents of such a position. So philosophers think that's what's being battled about in the sciences and as well as philosophy. That certainly was a question at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. It was a question in the sciences whether, for example, chemical phenomena were composed. That was a huge debate within chemistry and physics for a very long time. It was a huge issue, of course, whether biological phenomena were composed. But those issues have been definitively resolved in the sciences. So at the beginning of the 21st century, it hadn't been an issue about whether there was comprehensive composition in nature for many, many decades. Why? The reason, of course, is that 20th century science saw wave upon wave upon wave upon wave of what are called interlevel mechanistic explanations, not just in chemistry, biology, physiology, and now in the neurosciences and psychology. Interlevel mechanistic explanations work by explaining higher level phenomena in terms of lower level phenomena taken to compose them. Okay? Given the range and variety of those explanations, we now, I would contend, have pretty plausible evidence that there's comprehensive composition in nature. So, just to remind you, hopefully remind you, just to remind you what an interlevel mechanistic explanation might look like. Here's a higher level phenomenon, right? Here's a really interesting fact. Dendritic spines in neurons, they're incredibly dynamic. Neurons grow these dendritic spines in response to stimulations incredibly quickly, and they do it all the time, basically. So your neurons are constantly pushing out dendrites to other neurons in responses to stimulation, really on quite a real-time scale. How do we explain the formation of dendritic spines? We actually explain them in the same way we explain cellular motility, the same way we explain how cells move. We explain it in terms of the proteins that are the components of such cells. So in cells, we have this sea of actin monomers. And when you get a stimulation of a cell, say here, the actin begins to polymerize. And the polymers of actin push out the edge of the cell. So in cell motility, that happens. You push out an arm, which adheres, and then you release the adhesion of the back, pulls itself up, then it pushes out an arm. In dendritic spine growth, you have actin polymerization pushing out the lipid membrane in the place that pushes towards other neurons. Okay. So in these kind of cases, you have compositional relations between individuals, like cells and proteins. You have compositional relations between the properties, say motility, and the properties of the proteins. And you, I think, have compositional relations between the processes at the higher level and the processes at the lower level. Okay, we could go and talk about, I could go and talk about scientific composition for a very long time. But the interesting point for us today is that everyone in the sciences, because of these kinds of explanation, not just in cell biology, but in chemistry, neurophysiology, human physiology, everyone basically in the sciences now accepts that these kinds of explanations are pervasive and the compositional relations that they illuminate are comprehensive. In the sciences, right, in the sense of searching for these kinds of explanations and the compositional relations that they illuminate, everyone in the sciences is an everyday or mundane reductionist, where that just means that you're someone who looks for this kind of explanation and who looks for composition. Okay? So let's just call that a mundane reductionist, because everyone is this kind of reductionist. Everyday reductionism is the background to the new debates in the sciences. Okay? As I'm going to briefly explain, the debates now are about the implications of mechanistic explanation, the implications of composition. They're not about its existence. The existence of pervasive mechanistic explanation, comprehensive composition, is assumed. The fight is over what it entails. Okay? You can see that, I think, quite quickly by looking at the slogans of the two sides in the sciences. Okay? Those slogans basically show the commitment to comprehensive composition. So we have people like Steven Weinberg, right, Nobel Prize-winning physicist who comes up to try and grab all the money they needed for the super collider and has to explain why the hell we should spend that much money on fundamental physics. And Weinberg's response is, well, gosh, we know that wholes are nothing but their parts. So Weinberg and other scientific reductionists basically make this argument that everyday reductionism leads to this more substantive position of scientific reductionism that makes this claim that wholes are nothing but their parts. But because physics studies the fundamental parts, which are the fundamental parts of everything, we should spend disproportionate amounts of money on physics funding the super collider to look at those parts. On the other side of the debate, we have an army of scientific reductionists. And these reductionists go from the top, the sciences of complexity, neurophysiology, biochemistry, right down to the bottom. So, for example, one of the more interesting people who've pushed scientific emergentism recently is another Nobel Prize-winning physicist, the condensed matter physicist and theoretician Robert Laughlin. Scientific emergentists have still got the slogan that we had in the 19th century, that wholes are more than the sums of their parts, but they also have a new and equally important slogan: parts behave differently in wholes. And we'll come back to why that's important later on. Okay, so there are these two sides. I want to just go through now, why is it that so many people think that everyday reductionism must collapse into scientific reductionism? Throughout the talk, I'm going to try and leave aside terms like emergence, reduction, because they each have multiple meanings and they're each causing a huge mess in the debates. So my approach is just to leave the technical terms aside and cash out the notions that you're seeking to use and to express in other terms. Okay? So put the buzzwords aside and let's get to the meat of the ontological issues. So I think you can express Weinberg's basic position quite easily and clearly without using the term reductionism. And I think the basic argument is really quite simple too. The basic argument driving scientific reductionists is a simple ontological parsimony argument. Given its nature, we can call it the argument from composition. Okay? It's an argument, of course, that's very familiar from the history of philosophy, right? People have been struck by this argument for a very, very long time, again and again and again. The argument basically runs like this. When we have composition relations, the claim is that we can explain everything at both the lower and higher levels equally well just using the components. So when we have these two hypotheses about what there is, components on one side, that's reductionist, and components and composed entities on the other side, each of these hypotheses, says the reductionist, given mechanistic explanation, explains everything equally well. But the parsimony principle, Occam's razor, the principle of likeness, whatever name you want to give it, the parsimony principle says that when you have two hypotheses that explain equally well, you should accept the one that's committed to fewer entities. But of course, the hypothesis that there are only components is much simpler than the hypothesis that there are composed and component entities. So the argument from composition, using the parsimony principle, says that we can dispense with composed entities. There are weaker or stronger versions of that conclusion. You might just argue that composed entities are in no way determinative. Or you might go to the stronger conclusion that they don't even exist. The position that we get, I think, is quite usefully termed fundamentalism. This is Nancy Cartwright's nice term for this kind of position, because it's the view that in any case of interlevel mechanistic explanation, we should only accept that the lower level components are either determinative or exist. That's an non-local case. And of course, if you think mechanistic explanation is pervasive, you can make a global claim about the whole of nature. That the only things that we should ultimately exist are the fundamental components discussed in physics. Now, I actually think Weinberg is quite a sophisticated theorist, although nobody seems to give him credit for this. So everyone seems to have a problem with Weinberg for various reasons. But if you actually read Weinberg, which I spent quite a lot of time doing, scientific reductionists like Weinberg are actually pushing a quite sophisticated position. Despite this ontological reductionism at the top, Weinberg and other reductionists now claim that we should not dispense with the higher level sciences or their predicates. Weinberg explicitly says that he's what he calls a compromising reductionist, who accepts that only the components exist or are determinative, but furthermore argues that we still can't get rid of the higher sciences, their explanations and predicates. The resulting position is a position that philosophers really just have a tin ear. They just don't hear this position. for various historical reasons in their philosophical debates. The position is a thoroughgoing ontological reductionism combined with a thoroughgoing semantic anti-reductionism. Only the components exist or are determinative, but you need layers and levels of theory and predicates to explain and grasp all the truths about nature. That's important because I actually think it means that the scientific reductionism we just articulated is not a prey to the two big objections to a reduction in philosophy, which were actually unfortunately aimed at semantic reductionism, not a position like this one. We can talk about that in question time if you want, but... Okay, so that's what I think scientific reductionism in its best form looks like. I don't think Weinberg, as far as I can see, has any need for using participation. I really don't see where participation comes in for reductionists of this kind. But there's plausibly another life position in the sciences right now that's very different from Weinberg's. Okay? So physicists like Philip Anderson and Laughlin, chemists like Ilya Prigogine, all manner of systems biologists working on the nature of the proteins we find in cells, neurophysiologists like Walter Freeman, and armies of writers in the sciences of complexity have all pressed positions that they take explicitly to be opposing Weinberg's. Once again, let's just leave aside the term emergence and try and cash out what on earth these writers mean. What ideas are they trying to express using that term? I think at least one sense of I think there are many senses of emergence that get used in these scientific debates that don't pose any problem to the reductionist. But I do think there's one that's interesting. The one that's interesting, I think, is driven by a new array of evidence that we've got in the sciences quite recently. So one of the changes that we've seen over the last decades is that we're finally getting evidence about the nature of the components we find within the complex aggregations that we take to compose other entities. Okay? Looking at that new evidence about the components we find in complex aggregations, the emergentists have articulated what seem to be novel possibilities that I think have important implications. One of those implications is I think that they show that the argument from composition, the banner, the key argument for the reductionist, I think that we can see the argument is actually invalid, which is quite strong stuff for philosophers, right? Okay. Previously, when we first began to give interlevel mechanistic explanations, those explanations were really based around qualitative accounts of components and compositional relations. But in various disciplines from top to bottom in the sciences, we've recently made this advance, and we now have quantitative accounts of the nature of the components we find in aggregations. It's in these cases where we have this new evidence. So notice, this is not an argument from ignorance. This is an argument from a whole new battery of empirical evidence about the quantitative nature of components we find in aggregations. So I just want to briefly give you a couple of quotes from these guys, just so you know that I'm not completely making all of this up. So here is Freeman. It's quite a long quote. So Freeman's a neurophysiologist. He's very important in research on the olfactory bulb, but he also went on to look at kind of pioneer all kinds of mathematical innovations in understanding the behavior of neurons. Here's something that Freeman says. An elementary example is the self-organization of a neural population by its component neurons. The neuropil in each area of cortex contains millions of neurons interacting by synaptic transmission. The density of action is low, diffuse, and widespread. Under the impact of sensory stimulation, by the release from other parts of the brain of neuromodulatory chemicals, all the neurons come together and form a mesoscopic pattern of activity. The pattern simultaneously constrains the activities of the neurons that support it. The microscopic activity flows in one direction, upward in the hierarchy, and simultaneously the macroscopic activity flows in the other direction, downward. Here's another long quote from Laughlin, but let's just stick with Freeman because I'm not going to have time. There's a great deal to unpack in these passages, and you can find passages from a whole range of theorists who have similar ideas. I think that the ideas in these passages need to be given a more precise theoretical articulation, which is a role for philosophers like me, I hope. Okay? But though there's a great deal to unpack here, let's just stick to the points that I think are relevant for us today. Crucially, the claim is a claim about our new quantitative data about components in aggregations, whether it's atoms for Laughlin, proteins or neurons for Freeman. And the claim is that the new evidence shows that these components have powers in these aggregations that they would not have if their powers and behaviors were exhaustively articulated by the laws holding in simpler aggregation systems. So the idea is that these components have powers that you wouldn't expect them to have if you extrapolated the laws that hold of those components in simpler systems. On top of that claim, the emergentists then make the following claim. So these new powers, call them differential powers because they're different powers than they would have had if the laws were exhaustive. They claim that the powers of components, those components are determined to have those powers by the composed thing you find them in. Okay? So we find the scientific emergentists positing a new species of non-compositional, non-causal determination from the composed entities to their components. All right? This is a species of determination that's been overlooked by contemporary philosophers. I'm actually curious whether all the historical erudition we have here I bet the scholastics had a similar relation. And I'd love to know what the term was, because I could steal it. But here's the term I made up to talk about this, because I need some term. So I call this type of determination macresis or macretic determination. Okay? So the emergentist has got production across levels, it's got causation, and now it's got composition upwards, and it's got macresis downwards. Okay, here's the picture. So this is Chris Langton, one of the big shots in complexity, and here's his picture. He says mechanists only see determination upwards. Vitalists only see determination downwards. Emergentism is the beautiful sweet spot that we've missed for centuries, that the sciences have now illuminated to us. It's the position that you have composition upwards from the interrelated components, but we also have macresis downwards from the composed to the components as well. Okay, so what? All right. So what? In these cases, we look as if we've got comprehensive composition. Now that's something we could fight about, and I've defended it in various places in detail. But although we've got comprehensive composition, we still have a situation where the composed entities are determinative. They're playing a determinative role in nature. They produce effects at their own level, but they're also determinative because they alter or determine the powers of the components. Okay? They're macretically determining that the components have certain differential powers. So in the kind of cases that we're talking about, we've got full composition, but you cannot adequately explain everything just using the components. You need to posit the composed entity to explain powers of the components themselves. Okay? But that shows, at least I would contend, that the argument from composition is invalid. Its premises are true, we have universal composition, but its conclusion is false. Okay? So scientific reductionists have consistently and continually inferred far too much from the existence of pervasive mechanistic explanation. That's at least my diagnosis. This is all made worse because philosophers haven't engaged this type of argument, and so they've left it implicitly working and wreaking havoc in the scientific debates. Okay. I call the position that the scientific emergentist endorses mutualism, or mutualist physicalism. Why do I call it mutualism? It's committed to mutually determinative and interdependent entities. Right? We have species of mutual determination between parts and wholes. So I call it mutualism. I think it gives us powerful new resources for understanding composed entities and their natures, as well as understanding the structure of interlevel mechanistic explanation and the overall structure of nature itself. the problem has been that people assume that nature has this structure. And it's really easy to get parsimony arguments running if you think this is the structure of nature. It's pretty obvious that the guys at the top aren't doing a damn thing. The emergentist says the problem is that you've just begged the question because this is a picture that's compatible with pervasive composition. The guys at the top in this picture are composed, but nonetheless they're playing a determinative role in nature by configuring the components that compose them. You can't run parsimony arguments against this kind of position. Okay. All right, so I've given arguments elsewhere that if you want to be an ontological non-reductivist, methodological naturalist, then you have to cough up a price. Lots of anti-reductionists, including Jerry Fodor and others, have thought you can be an anti-reductionist without paying an ontological price. You can't. The price is being a mutualist. You've got two options as a methodological naturalist. You can either be a scientific reductionist and a fundamentalist, or you can be a mutualist. I don't think there's any coherent position in between that's defensible. All right. I think the issues between mutualism and fundamentalism are thoroughly empirical and empirically resolvable. I think the issues between them have yet to be resolved. Now that's a big fight that we have to go through all kinds of evidence from all kinds of cases, and I guess I've actually tried to do that in my book. The issues are empirical because the existence of differential powers is an empirical question. We can go investigate now the powers of components in different places. If there are no differential powers, mutualism is done, finished. The reductionist can march on to a glorious and very flat future. If we find differential powers, then mutualism is a live option, but it actually has to fight off a species of reductionism that says differential powers are determined by components. The fight then is what is it? Is it a composed entity that determines the powers or other components? Okay, I think that's an empirically resolvable question. All right, so to get finally to the point, there are anti-reductionist methodological naturalists. Remember when we started? Everyone assumes methodological naturalists have to be scientific reductionists or ontological reductionists, and they are just components. So who the hell needs participation? Well, there are anti-reductionist methodological naturalists who hold, I think, a coherent position that's live given our evidence. These people accept pervasive mechanistic explanation, they accept comprehensive composition, but they accept there are levels of entities in nature, and the higher levels exist. So for this kind of methodological naturalist, there is a question about fitting higher level entities into nature. I'm one of these guys. So, but gosh, what problems could a methodological naturalist have in this rosy world? Well, human agency and mental causation have obviously been a problem for a very long time. Objective mathematical entities are pretty clearly a problem. Objective moral aesthetic properties are pretty clearly a problem. And we could even throw the divine in nature as being a problem. Okay. There are obviously other problems as well. So is participation helpful in understanding these issues, even given all this lovely stuff we've added to our toolbox? So we've got, if you're a scientific emergentist, you don't just have production now, you don't just have composition, you've got a new relation to play with. Philosophers love to play with things, right? You've got a new, all theoreticians love new toys. Now you've got this mechanistic determination downwards. So you might ask, well, even with Mechanistic, do we really need participation? Okay, so this is fighting talk, obviously, but I don't think we need any help with mental causation or human agency. I think that the sciences of the mind-brain are doing spectacularly well once you add macresis and the machinery of mutualism. Now, of course, I'm not saying that solves all the problems right there, right? But I am saying that I don't think we need any more fundamental theoretical machinery to solve the issues of mental causation or human agency. In contrast, I think it's obvious that we have continuing problems fitting objective mathematical, moral, or aesthetic properties into nature. They're really profoundly deep and troubling problems. One continuing position which I find appealing is that these kinds of properties are in some sense transcendent because of their distinctive objectivity. Okay? Under this view, the objectivity of mathematical entities or moral properties or aesthetic properties doesn't reside in our thoughts about them. It transcends our thoughts. It transcends really any facts about nature. So it looks as if, in some sense, these entities are transcendent, and that's possibly the best way of thinking about them. Okay. Now, of course, I argued earlier that I don't think methodological naturalism has to reject the existence of transcendent entities. So why don't I just do a smash and grab? Why don't I just solve all my problems by, okay, saying there are transcendent entities? Then I account for the mathematical using those transcendent entities. Well, sadly, if you endorse the methodological picture of nature as involving pervasive mechanistic explanation of universal composition, you can't so easily accept the existence of transcendent entities that act or manifest themselves in nature. You can see the problem, even if you're a mutualist who rejects many of the theses beloved of scientific reductionists, which I think are basically dogmas. Even if you reject those dogmas, I don't think it's easy to endorse transcendent entities. You can see this using what we might call the blunt force model. The blunt force model assumes there's a transcendent entity, and then it says that transcendent entity just directly acts in nature and manifests itself in some way. The problem is that action and manifestation in nature is going to change the motions of masses. But everything in nature is composed by such masses. And an entity that changes the motion of masses is a force. And this kind of transcendent entity is a fundamental force, which is not physical. So on this model, we're left with a new fundamental force. That's what I would call blunt force trauma. Why is it traumatic for me as a methodological naturalist? Well, we're left committed to a new fundamental non-physical force, but we have overwhelming evidence from the mechanistic explanations that there are only 3, possibly 4 fundamental forces in nature, and they're all physical. So you can't get the transcendent into nature in this way, consistent with the evidence you accept as a methodological naturalist. We can make the same point using energies as well. Okay, so this is the point at which I think participation is really very interesting for the methodological naturalists of my species, right? Because it offers interesting resources for dealing with these transcendent entities. Basically, I think participation offers a way to bridge the immanent transcendent divide, but without resulting in traumatic implications at odds with our evidence. Now, there are obviously many notions of participation, very many that I don't have a grip on. So let me just use one, probably the only one that I have any grip on. So assume we have a transcendent property D that exists in some of its instantiations outside of space and time. Now assume that there's an instance of D that's instantiated in an individual in space and time. Let's also assume this individual is thoroughly composed, constituted, and that the instance of this property in space and time is completely composed or realized. Perhaps we can also assume that this instance of D is having a macretic determinative effect on its components. Okay, now here the instance of D instantiated in an individual in space-time, I think participates in the transcendent to the degree that I understand participation. So in some sense, it seems to participate in this transcendent entity. Okay? Now, but this instance is also perfectly acceptable to a methodological naturalist. We've brought the transcendent into nature in a way that is not violating our evidence. This instance of D is fully composed. It involves no fundamental forces that are new. Okay, so I think participation is potentially really quite an interesting tool for the methodological naturalist in dealing with the mathematical, the moral, or the aesthetic. Now, obviously, a great deal more needs to be said about why you need the transcendent and how this might help. But at least I hope my comments have begun to illustrate something along those lines. Maybe another example will help. So, change the phenomena. Take D to be the property of being divine. Let's take some instances, one instance perhaps, of the property of the divine, to be instantiated outside space-time. I think participation is really interesting for a methodological naturalist when you think about how one of our experiences could instantiate this property of being divine. Or how an artwork, and you can hear the echoes of Douglas's work for me, right? How an artwork could instantiate the property of being divine. It looks as if we can, by applying this model of participation, we can understand how an artwork could instantiate being divine in a way consistent with our methodological naturalist evidence. We can begin to understand how an experience could instantiate the divine consistent with methodological naturalism. So we can begin to see how you can have contact with the divine, which I find profoundly interesting. Okay, so to summarize, I'm finished. To summarize, please avoid the temptation to caricature methodological naturalists as scientific reductionists and ontological reductionists. The mutualist approach of scientific emergentism opposes, at least in one strand, opposes ontological reductionism. It's a live and coherent option. It's being actively explored in various areas of the sciences. Mutualism offers a range of new resources for non-reductivist methodological naturalists, and possibly those resources are necessary for defending a non-reductive methodological naturalism. More importantly for today, participation need not just be for those opposed to methodological naturalism. Okay, that's the point. Once we take a more judicious view of the scope of methodological naturalism and its implications, participation is one more tool that can aid in an understanding of nature in all its rich, multifaceted, and multi-leveled glory. That's Ooh, that was too long. Sorry.
No, that's great. Well, thank you very much for your tour de force, rebutting certain crass assumptions that some defenders of the idea of participation in divine ideas might harbour. Shall we, Don, am I right in saying that the right thing to do is now to go on to Phil, and then we'll have a general discussion after Phil Sloan's paper.
First, I want to very much thank Douglas and the Institute itself for inviting me to participate, and I've had some very interesting interactions, not only with Douglas, but also with Carl, and I'm hoping to have some further ones on this. Douglas has posed a question for us that, and my approach to this is going to be much more reaching back as an intellectual historian, and particularly the 19th century. But I want to indicate that some of the issues that Carl has raised are very interesting ones, which I think can give us some new options today. But we're going to go back a bit, because he wanted to know what has evolutionary theory done, robbed the idea of participation from any meaning in contemporary thought. Has it done this, and what's the way it's done it? And I think to answer this, first of all, there's an important essay by the philosopher Hans Jonas on the implications of Darwinism that posed a very similar question. And this was when he was commenting on the great change that had taken place in metaphysics with the coming of evolution. He commented as follows: obviously, this pattern completely reversed. This pattern of the traditional patterns can be completely reversed in the kind of genetic deduction which the modern evolutionary theory inaugurated. If the most elementary situations can of themselves give rise to all of the diversification and order, and the latter are explained by the dynamics of the former, then paradoxically speaking, the antecedent cause here is inferior to the effect. Now, concerning the issue of this conference, Jonas has, I think, put his finger on a very crucial issue. Since the broad acceptance of evolutionism by the scientific community around 1870, if not necessarily the Darwinian principle of natural selection, we have seen indeed a great collapse of the transcendent and immanent into the material. Nietzsche himself speaks in his Use and Abuse of History, written at important dates, 1873, after the appearance of the Descent of Man. He sees Darwinism as a true but deadly idea, and with some prophetic insight foresees a period in the future when individuals are being governed by systems of egoism, brotherhoods of rapacious exploitation, and systems of creations of utilitarian vulgarity. he says in his usual temperate language. But I think we see today, at least, how the human being has been reduced by many and by much of our conversation to this kind of, to the product that is depicted at the intersection of sociobiology, genetic determinism, and neurophysiological reductionism. And fortunately, I think we've seen from Carl some ways in which thinking around this. But I think we can sense how important in this, and Darwinism itself has been involved. Now, what I'd like to do today in these brief remarks is to take this historical approach and show the way in which this event happened by means of a specific and narrowly focused look at Darwin's work in relation to one of the last attempts to establish a transcendental dimension of biological science, and with this Darwin accomplished the kind of leveling that I think Jonas and Nietzsche and others have seen as possibly its implication. Now, the larger scenario I want to talk about here runs from interpretations of Kant in the late 18th century by individuals like Goethe into British reading of Germanophiles that form in the post-Napoleonic War, particularly around Samuel Taylor Coleridge. From there, we move on to the reflections on the influential London anatomist with whom Darwin was in direct interaction. And I want to begin here first with returning to Kant as the foremost Enlightenment thinker, that I think one of the things we haven't talked about here, also diagnosed as the problem perhaps of transcendence and participation, was the epistemological views of the project we can see from Locke through the French encyclopedists to Hartley and others. But he also, his critique of empiricism, but he also set out through the second part of the third critique of judgment devoted to issues of biology and teleology, a new philosophical agenda for the life sciences that was subsequently exploited by Goethe, Schelling, Treviranus, and many others. And in doing this, Kant also resurrected for us some key components of the Platonic and Neoplatonic tradition that supposedly had been put to rest by the empiricist tradition of Locke, Condillac, Diderot, and Hume. Now, in central importance is the concept of the transcendental ideas, which appears as a prominent dimension of the transcendental dialectic of the first critique. Now, while I fully agree that within Kant's epistemological strictures and architectonic project, these discussions need to be read in light of the noumenal phenomenal distinctions and the critical epistemology of the analytic, it is more interesting to me as an intellectual historian of science to understand the importance of misinterpretations of an author like Kant that transpired, and this is particularly important in the understanding of the impact of the dialectic and the later essays and third critique on reflections within the life sciences around 1800 and for a period after. Now, it's in the opening of his discussion of his ideas in general that opens the transcendental dialectic in the first critique, where I have this quote on the board, where he sets out his general discussion of how ideas function in relation to pure reason. Kant thus speaks as follows about, and here appealing directly to Plato. Plato made use of the expression idea in such a way as quite evidently to have meant by it something which can not only never be borrowed from the senses, but far surpasses even the conceptions of the understanding. And this is where he puts his categorical understanding of Aristotle occupying himself. And here's the point I highlight. For Plato, ideas are archetypes of the things themselves, and not in the manner of categories, mere keys to possible experiences. And then in a following passage that's fraught with significance for my topic, make sure I've got that, excuse me, I'm actually advanced. Okay, yeah, this is, but he says it's in regard to nature itself that Plato rightly discerns clear proofs of an origin from ideas. And here's I've highlighted. A plant, an animal, the orderly arrangement of the cosmos, presumably, therefore, the entire natural world, clearly show they are possible only according to ideas and though no single creature in the conditions of its individual existence coincides with the idea of what is most perfect in its kind, just as little does any human being in the moral realm, he goes on to say in the highlighted page, these ideas are none other than completely determined in the supreme understanding, each as an individual, and each as unchangeable, and are the original causes, the Ursachen of things at this point. Now I highlight two issues here. First is the direct return to Plato on the meaning of idea, which he here contrasts in this discussion to the notion of ideas as used in the empiricist tradition. Second, the ideas now seem to be served as the archetypes of the natural world located in the supreme understanding, even functioning as the true causes of things. We are back, it seems, in the world of the Timaeus and classical and Christian Neoplatonism, not in the Newtonian world where Kant is so often, and I think falsely, located. Of course, careful readers of the first critique are aware that as the dialectic proceeds to develop, it's only concerning ideas as regulative and never constitutive of reality that we should see this. But this text seems to go beyond these strictures. And the ideas, he says, are not merely fictions of the brain in one passage. Now here's where the creative misreading of Kant by his successors enters the picture. And I'm delighted here that Douglas Hedley has also seen the importance of Samuel Taylor Coleridge for his influence on a host of questions related to participation and transcendence in the 19th century. Because in his influential Biographia Literaria of 1817, one of the works that created this wave of British Germanophilia after the post-Napoleonic Wars had ended, Coleridge speaks of his appreciation for two Kants. One is the public Kant, who imposed limits on the mind, and especially on the idealizing functions of reason, in some respects to avoid censure of theologians. But then he claimed that the real Kant went beyond this and surely must have gone beyond the limits he imposed on knowledge of the thing in itself. It's through the imagination, the power of imagination, that reason, in fact, reaches through the ideas to a transcendental reality, and it is Kant who's given him ability to see this. As he says, in spite of, therefore, of his own declarations, I could never believe that it was possible for him, meaning Kant, to have meant no more by his noumenon, or thing in itself, than his mere words express. Now, Kant for Coleridge becomes the great Platonizer, the restorer of transcendental to philosophy, and through the power of the imagination, or Einbildungskraft in Kant's sense. The Coleridgean reading of Kant is to make him essentially a kind of Platonist. And through his influential writers and lectures, Coleridge conveyed this image to a close circle of disciples that we can follow directly into British anatomical science in the 1840s. Now, how is this relevant to evolutionary theory? I can only highlight this briefly with reference to one single issue, the use of transcendental ideas as a way of resolving the question of sameness in anatomy. Now, I'm going to short-circuit the historical story here and jump to an important breakthrough in this concept in some of the London lectures and particularly by this man, the comparative anatomist Richard Owen, and a person who's going to be before him, Joseph Henry Green, excuse me, this one right, I'll go back here. Yeah, this person who's also going to be his predecessor in this. Now, what we're looking at here are some anatomists in London around the mid-1840s. And this person, both Owen and his particular guide, the person who preceded him in this, a man by the name of Joseph Henry Green. Green is a lecturer in comparative anatomy at the College of Surgeons in London. He also becomes Coleridge's literary executor and synthesizer of his scientific work. So it's a very important linkage here. Now, the issue that faced comparative anatomists in the early 19th century was an old one. Since Aristotle, those investigating animal form and function were aware that one encountered a deeper resemblance of, as one went from the surface features to inner skeletal features. Well, what does this mean? if we can relate this to the discussions that we had yesterday, it can be seen that it involved empirically the meaning of univocity in anatomy and the degree to which universals were behind perhaps the creation of forms. The debate before Owen, addressed in the 1840s, had been particularly highlighted by French anatomist and doyen of French science, Georges Cuvier, in his disputes with his colleagues at the Paris Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle. And this would be particularly Jean-Baptiste Lamarck and a lesser-known individual, Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire. Both of these developed, and the latter, particularly Saint-Hilaire, developed on some post-Kantian speculations of Goethe's. This debate, which raged in French science in the 1820s, was over the apparent unity of type displayed by deeper anatomy. Was this resemblance that we can even see here schematized resulting from a similarity of function, the quasi-Aristotelian answer that was developed by Cuvier, or did it imply a deeper unity that might even suggest a common ancestry, as argued by Saint-Hilaire and Lamarck? At stake was the whole question of how living beings were related in time and space. Owen resolved this debate by a transcendental move. This was returned directly to the Coleridgean tradition that he had absorbed from his great teacher, Joseph Henry Green, and there will be some also additions to this from his friendship and reading of the works of the philosopher and polymath William Whewell, I'll mention briefly. Because what Whewell had done as another individual in this point was that he pushed some of the Platonized readings of Kant to a new level in the development of what he called an antithetical philosophy, or at least Menachem Fish, the philosopher of sciences, the antithetical philosophy. And Whewell had worked this out in a series of papers that are lesser known to people that know something about Whewell, on the fundamental antithesis of philosophy, on the Platonic theory of ideas, of the intellectual powers according to Plato. These are short essays that he wrote. What this amounted was a blend of Platonized Kant and some insights drawn from the identity philosophy of Schelling. And as Whewell developed, the important thing about this, as Whewell develops, is the transcendental idea can't stand by itself, but it must also have an empirical reference which is available empirically, and this stands in some kind of relationship of both the ideal and the real in this particular way. Now, Owen is taking this as well as some of that Coleridgean tradition. And what he does is develop this in the notion of a way of resolving these questions in the notion of a transcendental archetype that govern both the genesis of forms and their relationships. The similarity to Kant's comments that I made earlier about archetypes and the supreme understanding that causally govern the natural world should be recalled, because this is very much how Owen is interpreting these. It's not simply a regulative principle or a simple idealization. It also has empirical reference, and that's what he gets from Whewell. Now, what he is positing of this transcendental ideal form was a principle of creative design. It also functioned as an immanent quasi-Newtonian causal law by which forms were developed in historical time. And with this, Owen provided for the first time a coherent solution to those French debates over what is the meaning of sameness and identity in anatomy. He does this by first making a distinction between analogical relations, which are similarities of function, the wing of a bird and the wing of a bee, we might say, and homological relations of true identity, with this identity grounded now in the rational derivation of parts from this transcendental archetype. All parts of the vertebrate skeleton could now be envisioned as formed on the ideal archetypal plan with the archetypal unit of vertebrae showing, working here, the archetype at the top. An ideal vertebrae can be seen as forming just by its serial connections, all of those, and then we see the part-by-part relations to fish, to reptiles, and then he even will include human beings and birds in this diagram. Now, this is an important breakthrough, because with this, he could now explain the skeletal similarity of the parts, the similarity of the wing of a bat to the flipper of a seal, could be interpreted now as revealing true identity because of its relationship to this archetypal transcendental entity. And with this breakthrough, Owen is now able to make a profound reform of the language of comparative anatomy, as important as that of Lavoisier in chemistry. One can now speak univocally, and not analogically or not partially, of a femur in the hind limb of an elephant and a seal, or the similar a temporal bone in a porpoise in a human being. And one can explain why this was so, why the forelimbs and hind limbs also showed similarity in structure because of this reference here. But the point I emphasize is that these solutions and revisions were in reference to this transcendental realm known through reason that stood beyond experience and informed the empirical realm. It was related to traditional doctrine of divine ideas. And as he developed his theory and writings, anatomy revealed now a plan of what he called ordained becoming, as he termed it, that led to the gradual historical divergence from the archetype form, resulting eventually in the upright posture of the human being. Okay. Now, awareness of Owen's work, as it developed in the 1840s, seems to have been fundamental to Darwin's development of his mature theory of evolution that he worked out between 1856 and 58, and then quickly condensed it to form the published Origin of Species in 1859. By adopting the 1840s, Owen's distinction of analogy and homology, he could at last make a clear distinction between various kinds of relationship. This was the key to his theoretical importance of his long years of working on barnacles that formed after he was aware of Owen's concepts, and also some of his parallel work on plants. These were efforts to reveal an archetypal invertebrate and an archetypal plant in this relationship, not simply in the vertebrate relationship that Owen had worked out. It's no wonder that he calls comparative anatomy, in the final chapter of the Origin, the very soul of natural history. And if you think about it, how much of the time the displays and everything else one sees about the truth of evolutionary theory are displays of comparative anatomy or comparative biochemistry in some form. Okay, so this is why Darwin sees it. But what is remarkable, and would have even been more so to Darwin's contemporaries like Whewell and Owen, is how he then reinterprets Owen's concepts. First, he materializes the archetype. It is no longer an ideal type, but a concrete material form. One can now literally apply univocal anatomical parts across groups, and not, as he terms it, metaphorically, and these archetypal derivations he now applies to both to invertebrates and to plants. Second, he historicizes the archetype. It's a form that must have existed in the past at some point from which all vertebrates, and even eventually further back, even invertebrates and plants, have been materially derived. And as he wrote in the inside back cover to his copy of Owen's popular presentation, I look at Owen's archetypes as more than ideal, as a real representation, as far as the most consummate skill and loftiest generalization can represent in the primitive form of vertebrata. His theory of descent with modification by the action of natural selection now for him more satisfactorily explains all these organic similarities and resemblances. We have a quote here from the Origin. What can be more curious than the hand of man formed for grasping, that of a mole for digging, the leg of a horse, the paddle of the porpoise, the wing, should all be constructed on the same pattern and should include the same bone in the same relative position. The explanation is manifest in the theory of natural selection of successive slight. If we suppose that the ancient progenitor, notice what's happened, the archetype, so these two have been related, as it may be called, of all mammals had its limbs constructed in the general pattern, for whatever purpose they serve, we can once perceive the plain signification of the homologous construction of the limbs throughout the whole class. Now, this profound materializing and historicizing of Owen's concept by Darwin has not only given it a naturalistic account of something that he continues in his stylized rhetorical framework to attribute to the other tradition to a tradition of special creationism, which Owen was not incidentally defending. Owen is really defending something quite different than special creationism. He's also denied any transcendental reference involved in comparative analogy, either in the sense of the universal idea in the Plato-Kant-Coleridge sense, or even more proximately in the methodological dialectic between ideas and real things that he derived from Whewell. Darwin also denied the reading of the archetype as an immanent Newtonian causal principle governing the generation of form. All this prior discussion has collapsed in genetic derivation of forms in material history under the action of natural selection. To return to Jonas's observation at the opening of this paper, Darwin has indeed replaced the primacy of a transcendental cause of archetypal reasoning and the possibility of divine participation in the historical generation of life by a genetic process of derivation of the more complex from the lesser. Now, I've given here a brief view of what may be seen as the last effort, at least within the life sciences, to maintain a transcendental framework that we can relate to prior discussions of ancient, medieval, Renaissance philosophy. Darwin's revolution accompanies historically the general collapse, at least within life science, of the input of absolute idealism, Schelling's naturphilosophy, and organic romanticism, all of which had played an important role in earlier biological thought, and particularly in that post-Kantian period. Indicative of this fact is the fate of the publication of the anatomist Joseph Henry Green's major posthumous synthesis of Coleridge's aesthetic, scientific, philosophical, and theological writings in his two-volume Spiritual Philosophy, published in 1865. And if you can find a copy of this, I recommend it because it pulls together a whole lot of Coleridge's somewhat scattered views into a systematic synthesis of aesthetics, art, and philosophy and theology. The work fell stillborn from the press. It seems to have had only a few hostile reviews, having been written and as people saying, well, this is the age of Darwin, of Maxwell, of steam engines, and so forth. And as George Henry Lewis says in a review, I'm too far removed from the methods and results of such philosophical speculation to recognize any value in it. Nietzsche's comments of 1873 indicate some of the reasons why this indicates for some what seems to have happened with Darwinism as one of its chief causes. How can we can recover the transcendent in a world dominated by the consequences of the Darwinian evolution is an unfinished but urgent task that I think Carl Gillett is maybe helping us begin to think about in another way. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We've had two absolutely fascinating papers. On the one hand, the brilliant rebuttal of any crass opposition between naturalism on the one hand and the idea of participation in the divine, and his own very intriguing construal of a possibility of reconciling naturalism and participation. On the other hand, we've now just had a very extraordinary account of how the very story of evolution, evolutionary theory, is much more complex and nuanced than some might imagine. I've been struck for some time by the fact that, given in the US the religion and science debates, that in England in the 19th century, it was Owen who was one of the fiercest critics of Darwin, and Kingsley and various other theologians were much more open to Darwin. So there you have the odd scenario of the theologians being more enthusiastic about evolutionary theory than the scientists in the 19th century. But I think Phil's paper has helped explain why Owen, of all people, would have been particularly irritated by aspects of Darwin's theory. So thank you very much indeed to both of our speakers.
We'll now open up the floor for questions, and again, ask you to identify yourself and to speak loudly. So our first question is right down here. Steve, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself when Nick brings you the mic?
This is Steve Weikstra from Calvin at the Center for Philosophy of Religion this term. Carl, one thing I didn't understand, the way you characterize the top-down type of explanation or pattern of explanation is that you find laws, I'm going to get the terms a little bit wrong, but you find laws when you look at things behaving as members of a composed entity that you wouldn't expect if you just extrapolated from the laws they have in isolation. Well, would this be an example of that? I mean, suppose you just had one particle in the universe and you characterized its laws, and then you add another particle and you find a gravitational interaction between them. If you just extrapolated, and so the two particles, that's like a simple composed entity, not very related, but that doesn't seem like it would be a very interesting type of sort of top-down pattern. But it fits your characterization of it, because there you have a law you wouldn't get just by extrapolating from the single entity. So I'm thinking there must be something more to this, these type of, to use a term you don't want to use, emergent properties or emergent laws than you would find in that scenario. And I'm wondering if you could, is that right? Is there more? And what do you need to add to your description? The description that you find patterns of it that you wouldn't expect just from extrapolation from the simple.
No, great. So I think let's be a little bit richer in our description of what physicists actually do. So where do physicists look for these fundamental laws of everything? They look in simple systems. So they don't look, so they're well aware that the fundamental entities form relations, and what they're interested in, what are the laws that describe those relations between the fundamental entities. That's the base set of laws. So that's why you're supposed to build the supercollider. The supercollider looks at these situations where you have small, simple systems of these fundamental entities, and you mess around with them to articulate the laws that govern these entities in relation. So it's always collectives, what I call collectives. It's always fundamental individuals with their putatively fundamental properties and their fundamental relations. You then take the laws that govern their powers and behaviors in those systems, and then the claim is that those are the laws, those are the only determinative laws. Everything else, insofar as it's determined at all, is determined by those laws and the way you're going to continue to permute those fundamental relations. So your case wouldn't yet count. So that's the base from which we're supposed to be working. Then, why is that in contrast to the picture that the emergentist is pushing in these other cases? Well, the idea is supposed to be, so Laughlin says something as radical as this. You apply the laws of quantum mechanics to superconductors, for example, and you don't articulate the behaviors of electrons in superconductors. Electrons do things in superconductors that are not covered or predicted by the quantum mechanical laws of simpler systems. So his idea is that basically he's committed there's some further law that must be kicking in. That law looks as if, given the reductionist, the emergentist interpretation, is inalienably referring to the composed entity, the superconductor. Now, whether or not you buy the claim about electrons and superconductors is not the point, right? The point is that's the kind of the basic picture. I think you can articulate it with a lot more rigor and precision to describe what kind of laws they're committed to. They're rejecting the completeness of physics. The completeness of physics is one of the empirical issues under debate, because the completeness of physics is committed to the laws in those simple systems being such that they determine what the fundamental entities do insofar as they're determined everywhere. The emergentist rejects that. I hope that answered that.
Our next question, Billy, you want to introduce yourself too when you get the mic?
Billy Abraham, Southern Methodist University and the Center for Philosophy of Religion. I want to try and firm up a question about the specificity of transcendence and the specificity of participation in this discussion. Partly prompted last night by the use of the hermetic. And coming from Ireland, where we believe in the little people, it's easy to have a very broad range of agents, so to speak, and actions. But it's very unclear when you get to these very general concepts of transcendent and the participation, exactly what we're trying to get a hold of. Now, I want to frame the issue maybe this way. If you come at it from theology, one way to think about it is to think of the divine, and this is a contested way to think about the divine, but to think about the divine as an agent with certain powers, which that agent may or may not exercise. So there's genuine freedom. And that specific actions, like, say, the action of atonement in the death of Christ, is then explained in terms of certain intentions and purposes. Now, that's got a kind of relatively robust sort of content to it. Now, what I'm interested in is either historically or conceptually, you can go either way on this. What help can we get on the talk about transcendence and participation, which will get us beyond these very general open-textured notions to what might be within shouting distance, so to speak, of the divine, at least as I understand it, say, from someone like Athanasius or the Cappadocians and whatnot. That's my question.
I will make an initial comment because I think that was an interesting, important to make that distinction between simply transcendence and participation. And I will concretize it by just using one example from my talk. And this seemed to me in the kind of philosophy of science that the philosopher William Whewell was trying to work out. Now, Whewell is a reverend, and I think he's been mistakenly read as Popper before the fact, but he's actually much more interesting than that. And because what he was really trying to do was what I felt would be work out a philosophy of participation, and that is that there's an ideal realm, the true realm, which is accessed by the ideas of the mind, but this also has some sort of causal relationship in even empirical laws that work in the empirical world. And it seemed to me that's more than simply transcendence. That's actually participation. And it was behind this notion that I think Owen very much picks up about this historical development of life being what he called this ordained becoming, which eventually results in the unusual posture and anatomy of the human being. But that would be one meaning, but that's just a very specific historical one, and that isn't giving us a general view. But I do think the distinction is important between simply transcendent and the notion that the transcendent realm also participates in some way, not just in the theologically larger sense, but actually in the actual existence of life, you might put it, as this was being developed. But maybe someone else has some other comments on that.
Well, I think that the question also, just one very quick remark. The Cappadocians, as far as I know, are full of the language of participation. Gregory of Nyssa, in particular, and part of that is because of their philosophical schooling. And that philosophical schooling, of obviously a predominantly Hellenic kind, has an ingrained worry about anthropomorphism. And that, of course, goes back to Xenophanes and the Xenophanes' proto-Feuerbachian critique that the Thracians and the Ethiopians are projecting gods that just resemble themselves, or if the ox and the horses were to have gods, they would have gods like oxes and horses. I mean, that challenge, I think, is a very deep one in the ancient philosophical and theological context. So, sure, agency, even Plotinus uses the language, as it were, hoion, of freedom and something like personality of the supreme being, but always with this worry about anthropomorphic distortions. And I think the language of participation historically has also been important to try to conceive the relationship between the divine and the world in a philosophically nuanced way that avoids some of the absurdities of the handworker model, the crude maker of a projected agent. And also, I think the other important aspect of the participation model is precisely in terms of the relationship between the divine and the world, and the key concept of the goodness of that source. If the source of all being potential and actual is good, then that goodness must be reflected in the world, and the world must in some sense be an image of that transcendent goodness, however imperfectly. So I think that those are some of the reasons why these thinkers have been using language of participation alongside, of course, the language of the agency and personal nature of the divine.
Can I follow up? So, and of course I'm not an expert in participation, but so in my talk I focused on a property of being divine. Your question raised the issue of participation not focused on properties, but participation focused on individuals. So nothing I said really maps onto the question of how an individual, a divine individual as it were, is going to be accounted for using the account of participation I gave. Goodness, the property of goodness, of course, would fit nicely into the picture I gave, right? I mean, I'm curious. So I'm also curious about how participation works for individuals as well as for properties. Now, of course, one obvious thing to say is the individuals have properties that then have the relation of participation. Maybe that's the way it works. But, right, I also share there are other things you can say about how to get divine agency in the world. Maybe emergentists have things to say about that. But I'm curious how participation...
We're just about out of time, but with the indulgence of the presenters, we can go a couple more minutes. Take one more question. John.
My name is John Marks, and I'm a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study this year. I'm still trying to wrap my mind around Carl's concept of macresis. And philosophers of science always want to talk about physics when you want to hear about biology. So I'm trying to get a sort of biological image in my mind. And I guess what comes to mind is the idea that evolution is fundamentally about bodies, but classically we've theorized it about genes. And yet going from genes to bodies is generally a very black-boxed situation. Of course, it's the big lie of the Human Genome Project 25 years ago, that when we learn all this stuff about genes, we will sort of automatically have an explanation of bodies. But I think we've also known for a long time that in order to develop normally as a human being, you need a social life. And unsocial human organism is a highly pathological human organism. So there's got to be more there than just the genes. I'm not saying anything necessarily spiritual, but something at least social in order for normal development. Is that kind of what you mean when you say that a composed entity helps explain the components when you talk about that?
Okay, John. So you asked for other examples, not from physics. Now, of course, Freeman is not a physicist. Freeman is, a neurophysiologist. He's interested in the olfactory bulb. His example is populations of neurons and neurons. Another place that you find these types of positions is in systems biology. So now, there's very many things you can mean by systems biology, but one group of systems biologists seem to endorse this strain of emergentism. And their claims are the following. They claim that proteins in cells, when they have the relationship to other proteins that you find in cells, have powers that are not the ones they would have if the laws holding of those proteins in simpler systems, say in a petri dish, that they would have. Okay? So that's an issue they're investigating putatively, they say empirically. So you look at what it does in vivo and in vitro, and then you do the horribly complex work you have to do to try and articulate the powers, behaviors of the protein. They claim that certain proteins have powers in cells that they wouldn't have if the laws operating in simpler systems were the only laws. So there are these differential powers. And then the claim is that it's being a component of a cell that partially determines those differential powers being had by the component proteins. So that's, I hope, a biological case. I don't know whether you...
Could I make just a brief comment on precisely on that point? Because it seems to me that one of the interesting things that you can see in the biological sciences today is the introduction, along with the sort of issues that Carl's talking about, of a whole set of new terms: robustness, plasticity, niche construction, that if you look at those in a longer term, we're sort of getting back Aristotelian formal and even imminent final cause into but we're talking about it in different terms. So that's a different, even a newer dimension, I think, to some of the things that he's commenting on here, and that we're really, it's very interesting to see that development of a terminology that's now accompanying this kind of biological emergentism and epigenetics and so forth that's coming up.
Douglas, you have the last word.
Well, I've enjoyed this session immensely, not least because old Samuel Taylor Coleridge was mentioned. And I'd just like to thank our two speakers for giving us such an exciting session.